the kind of subtitle of the book is A Cultural History of Carrie the Musical, because I wanted to look at why, the factors that drove this show to be created in the first place, why it was born, why it flopped in the way that it did, why it received this kind of visceral reaction from the press and from some audience members, and then why it came back to life again, why that kind of fan campaign happened that kind of drove to it being revived so many years later, and now why it's performed in a different form all around the world.
Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture podcast. Thank you for listening. I want to just remind you all that if you're not following us on social media, please do. It's always nice to interact with you all, and I'm always posting clips from the podcast, information about our free book club that's on Zoom, and all other kinds of exciting events, and a lot of literary posts. So Instagram is at Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and so is our Facebook. We have a LinkedIn, a YouTube channel where you might be watching us now. So hi, there's a video episode on YouTube. And our TikTok is actually my name. It's at dr.andrewrimby. And Patreon is where you can find all the just uncensored, no ad episodes. It's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. There's usually some kind of deal going on, and you can try it out for a few days for free if you just want to see what gets posted there. And if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. It means a lot. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you're following us. And I hope you all just enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I am really excited to be joined with Chris Adams, who I've known in the podcast world for at least probably 3 years, 2.5 years, when his podcast that he co-hosts with Holly Morgan called Out for Blood, the story of Carrie the Musical, made its shocking arrival. We'll get into all of that. But I first want to let you know that he met actually Holly, his co-host, when he directed her in a student production of Bat Boy the Musical at the Edinburgh Fringe in 2006. Ever since, they've shared a passion for offbeat musicals, particularly those where everybody's dead by the curtain call. I love that. Well, that makes sense with Carrie. In the real world, Chris works in marketing in London's glittering West End, and he's worked similar roles for several London venues and producers. He's also a keen director in the city's thriving amateur and community theater scene. So, without further ado, here is Chris. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Wow, what an introduction.
Well, I have to be suspenseful while also hitting all the high points or flop points in the case of
Yeah,
Carrie.
yeah.
So, I remember having just learned about Out for Blood, your podcast with Holly. Um, First, because I had a fascination and love, as so many in your book do. For everyone out there, we're going to be talking about Chris's new book, titled Out for Blood. Out for Blood, A Cultural History of Carrie the Musical. And you do more than 80 interviews in this book. And what I'm fascinated with, maybe to start, is just like myself, when Carrie the Musical entered everyone's vernacular, like people remember vividly when they remember listening to the musical, and just it was very secretive to discover it after it left the Broadway stage.
Yeah.
So, like, let's start there. Where do you remember learning about Carrie the Musical?
I think, like you say, so many people have found the show kind of by accident, and it becomes this kind of almost like this little cult of people that knew about the show and kind of desperately wanted to tell people about it. So when I was back many years ago, when I was a teenager, I was a huge reader. I used to read Stephen King's novels. But I was also like a theatre kid at school. So I used to love going to the theatre and reading about theatre and learning all I could about theatre. So I think, the day I discovered there was this weird mashup of the two passions in my life was really exciting. And to discover this really unlikely sounding show, a musical based on Stephen King's Carrie, which, on paper sounds like the most unstageable story you could, put on a Broadway stage. So I was just really excited. And this was, kind of as the internet was emerging. I remember we had the internet at home and school, but it was those early days of the internet when it was like GeoCities and those kind of early websites. So I kind of made it my mission to find out everything I could about this musical. And there were lots of little clips of the show that audience members had made in the 80s, photos and reviews and things like that. And it kind of lodged in the back of my mind. And later when I went to university, and as you say, when I met Holly, we kind of got a bit obsessed afresh with this show because we were both similar. We both loved kind of offbeat musicals and strange theatrical tales. And we kind of set about researching the show. But it wasn't until much, much later again, until COVID, when we got together and we said, wouldn't it be cool to kind of we were both sitting at home with not much to do, as all of us were in the same situation. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool to kind of track down the people who'd been involved in the creation of the show and kind of find out if the stories we'd heard about this infamous flop in quotation marks were true, and to kind of bust some of the myths that had developed over the years. And we just kind of set about doing it. And then we got enough. We initially kind of thought we'd make maybe 4 or 5 episodes of a podcast about Carrie, and we ended up, I think we're now on about 15 or 16. So we kind of, we were really, it was so gratifying to be able to speak to people who were just so passionate about this show that had been dismissed by so many people over the years as being this unmitigated disaster. To be able to speak to people who'd been there and kind of hear their side of the story was just so fascinating. And that's kind of how the story of Out for Blood started.
And what's really interesting is the audience, their appetite for Carrie the musical, everything in your podcast, and especially you draw this out so nicely in your book, is the cultural history surrounding how Stephen King's novel, how it leads into the film version, how those from the film version, I'm thinking specifically of Larry Cohen, and then eventually
Yes.
Betty Buckley get involved, and that it's really this evolution and journey. And I think you start your book with there was so much hope going into this musical in 1984 in the Broadway workshop. And what's interesting though is like the audience really did drive the fandom around this. Like the cast, from everything I've heard in your podcast, from my research, from having Eric Champney on my show and like
Yeah.
his deep dive with his film and the master cut and all of that, that the cast really took a little while, especially Lindsay, I would say, who everyone out there, if you don't know, Lindsay played Carrie on Stratford and Broadway in the
Yeah.
original. That like it was very traumatizing for a lot of the cast and even the production team. So, when you were creating your podcast with Holly and then you started to do these interviews, did you find that it did take some coaxing for the cast and the creative team to eventually understand that this was about passion, not about mocking?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, some people were really keen and talked about the show straight away, really enthusiastically. Some people were less keen to talk about it because the show just has a history, as you say, of being mocked. It kind of became this huge joke. And we were always very careful, I hope, to kind of, our podcast was lighthearted and hopefully funny, but we always tried to stay on the right side of, we never wanted to make fun of the show. We certainly didn't want to make fun of the people involved in it. We approached the story as fans of this show and as fans of the people involved and kind of admirers of the work that they've done. And at the back of our minds was always this question about, can something be called a flop if it is still talked about all of this time later, and if it's affected so many people so deeply over the years, can something be kind of dismissed so quickly? I think that was what really drove us. Um, and yeah, some people, as you say, the cast were very young. It's a show about teenagers, high school students mostly, and so they were very young when they did the show. Lindsay was only 17 when she was given the part, which is insanely young to be given this leading lady. She was the RSC's youngest ever leading lady at the time. She was given this Broadway leading role, thrust into the spotlight, and then of course it was all kind of snatched away from her. This sort of dream was taken away, much like Carrie's story. And I don't want to speak on behalf of Lindsay, but from what she's told us, that was extremely traumatizing as a young person, and took a long time to get over. Her immediate thought was, people are going to blame me for this. This is going to scar my career for life. But luckily they didn't. And people, Lindsay's performance, Betty's performance, some of those performances are some of the greatest performances that have ever happened on a Broadway stage, according to so many people. And Lindsay has gone to an incredible career, thankfully. And, but it's still kind of, I think in their minds, there's still a hesitation about talking about this show because they think people are out to kind of to make fun of it. And some people have kind of have quickly moved on, and they were very out for talking about it and joking about it and talking about all of the silly things that happened to them and that they were part of. Other people, it did take some coaxing, but I think when they realized that we were out to treat the story respectfully, they were happy to talk to us. And I think that's partly why the book was possible, because we sort of made the podcast as we were releasing it. So it was very hard to kind of insert people as they appeared to us. Once we started talking to people, of course, they were introducing us to more people. We ended up with this huge kind of list of people that we would have loved to speak to, because we told the story of the show chronologically in the podcast. It was sort of too late to insert lots of them. So being able to go back and speak to all of those people who had listened to the podcast, enjoyed it, and realized that we were out to tell the kind of truthful story of what happened back in the 80s and since then, was really great in terms of filling up that book, because I was able to patch together all of the gaps that we may have had in the podcast to start with, and kind of tell a wider story. And I think, the kind of subtitle of the book is A Cultural History of Carrie the Musical, because I wanted to look at why, the factors that drove this show to be created in the first place, why it was born, why it flopped in the way that it did, why it received this kind of visceral reaction from the press and from some audience members, and then why it came back to life again, why that kind of fan campaign happened that kind of drove to it being revived so many years later, and now why it's performed in a different form all around the world. It's a really unique story, and as I've said, can you really call something a flop if it does have that sort of life to it?
Well, and you start with Lindsay's quote. I like to think of it now as the most successful flop on Broadway. And I think that really sums up how much it is in our zeitgeist in
Yeah,
conversation with Broadway musicals. And when I, approach this with students, I approach it with the source material. So Stephen King's novel, I remember in his book on writing, he really lays out how he had thrown away the early draft of Carrie. And then his wife Tabitha actually picked it out of the trash can and said, "No, I think you have something here. It's almost a Cinderella story gone wrong." And it's very Greek. Like in the beginning of his concept, Stephen King really was drawing upon like these ancient Greek, almost Persephone meets Cinderella. So it had
yeah.
this really twisted fairy tale-ness. And I thought it was so interesting though, like if that's the beginning of our source material, which is already an avant-garde horror novel, it makes sense why it's evolution. Like even when we're seeing what happens with the film version, has so much cinematography that like I'm
Mm,
thinking of even like Betty's death scene, or when we see Sissy Spacek in the prom, like all the different shots of every person's face, like everything, it's experimental, even in,
yeah,
the crucifixion of her mother in the death scene, that then the musical becomes experimental in its own way with, right, the dancing is experimental of
yeah,
like pop, pop flashy 80s Debbie Allen choreography meets the tragic opera. And
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it does let all the performers, like it's so refreshing. And maybe that's why we are so enthralled, Chris, because
Yeah.
it lets the performer shine, you
Exactly. And
know?
so, yeah, so many of them said, we may have been a disastrous musical, but we were never boring. And I think,
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons why the show has lived on in people's hearts and minds, because, there were hundreds of shows that closed quickly in the 80s and since then, but nobody talks about them anywhere near as much as this. And as you say, I think it's because it was so daring and so different for its time. It had to be, I think, because the story was there was, it had a daring director. It had a director known for working on classical plays mainly. And he brought that knowledge and experience to the show. It didn't particularly translate in the minds of kind of casual theatre goers at the time. And that's one of the kind of many reasons that it ended up closing, because people, at first watch couldn't perhaps understand what was happening in front of them. It was a very complex and avant-garde staging. I think since then, lots of people have gone on to reassess the show, and I hope we may have played a little part in that, in introducing the show to people and having them watch it and listen to it and kind of rethink what the show can be. I think, since then, with the show being rewritten and tweaked, so many new directors have had the opportunity to put their stamp on the story. And I think that says a lot about Stephen King's original source material. It's a story that so many people, despite it ending in massacre and murder, it's so many people see themselves in aspects of that character, or see, particularly people, I think, who've been involved in theatre, and those kind of theatre kids from school who might have been picked on and might have been bullied and maybe felt other or different. We heard from so many people who just love this story and love the material it was changed into when it went on stage. And I think part of that is that feeling of being slightly different to your peers, and seeing yourself in that character. Even if your own story doesn't end quite as dramatically as Carrie's story does, I think there are so many aspects of the story that people can kind of cling to. And I think that translates again into the life of the musical, and the fact that the musical was misunderstood and slammed by critics, but also kind of redefined in the future. I think so many people relate to that aspect of the story too. So it's a really unique melting pot of different aspects of people's personalities and psychologies. And I think that's what I really love about the story of Carrie, is that it's not just a straightforward tale of a musical that flopped. There's so much more to it.
Well, and isn't it true that, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but the director of the Carrie musical, um, he was basing it off of Lulu, the opera by Berg? Or I remember something about
Yeah.
like
Oh,
that almost German expressionism enters the scene, like almost Bluebeard's Castle, like those Gothic operas.
yeah, almost. It was actually two of the writers who saw Lulu at the Met in New York, and were kind of, as they left. This is Michael Gore and Lawrence D. Cohen, who were the composer and the book writer of the show, and Cohen had also, as you mentioned earlier, he'd written the screenplay of the Carrie movie. And as they left the opera Lulu, which is sort of this very violent opera, which involves all of these crazy twists and violent deaths, they sort of said, if Berg had been alive today, I bet he would write an opera based on Carrie. And they had one of those light bulb moments where they thought, actually, that could really work. And they didn't end up writing an opera, but they wrote a musical. But I think it was a very different musical to the one they ended up seeing staged. Later, it was taken on by Terry Hands, who was the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, who, as we've said, had this very kind of classical background. And in Carrie's story, he did see these kind of elements of Greek myths and biblical stories and fairy stories, and pulled all of those strands together into quite a unique, very unusual staging, let's say, which was not what people were expecting. It was certainly not realistic to the story. It was very symbolic, very avant-garde. It pulled together all of these references that I think a lot of people just didn't understand, and so they very quickly dismissed the show. They're expecting to see this kind of high school, high-kicking musical, because they knew Debbie Allen was there, and she was well known for choreographing and starring in Fame. And Debbie went into the show, I think probably she knew what Terry was trying to do, I think, but her background was in these kind of high school set musicals and very aerobic 80s style, modern dance styles, which didn't quite gel with the directorial and the kind of aesthetic approach that Hans brought to the story. So yeah, it was a strange mishmash of styles and approaches, but we've ended up with this musical that we're still talking about today. So maybe there was something in it.
Well, and before Carrie, there was really no high school musical that really had so much dancing. Like, I mean, there was Grease, but I consider Grease a parody. Like, I don't consider it.
Yeah,
I mean, but right in the 80s, you had Footloose, but it wasn't a music on stage. It was right with
yeah,
Sarah Jessica Parker, Kevin Bacon.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
the film version. So, like, there's so much high school films that, Fame, like you've said, of course. And I even think Thank God It's Friday had come out. Um,
yeah.
so
I
like right,
mean,
we're in the disco age. So it's
yeah, yeah.
fascinating.
I mean, Broadway was a very different place then, and this is something that I delve into a bit. When we think of Broadway now, we think of a very different set of shows. There are shows aimed very squarely at families. There are shows about teenagers and about young people and their problems and their everyday stories. You can go and see Heathers and Six and Legally Blonde and all of these kind of shows, which I know aren't on Broadway anymore, but they're very much in the kind of in the sort of musical theatre fans world. Back in the 80s, there was very little aimed squarely or about young people. It was the idea of putting what was ostensibly a horror story on stage was, crazy. People laughed about it. It was a very, Cats was probably the most different and challenging thing on Broadway at the time because it was this sort of sung through epic mega musical that had been imported from the UK and didn't sort of have a linear plot as such. But around Cats were all of these sort of hangovers from days gone by, lots of revivals of comfortable musicals that people could just kind of sit and enjoy and let it wash over them, lots of plays. So stuff like Carrie was very different and shocked people, and it was very hard to get people to part with their money because it was challenging and it wasn't easy. It was very different to what they were used to. You see it now when a very challenging new piece opens, particularly since COVID. People sort of want to know that they're going to spend their money and get a good night out and enjoy something that they're familiar with almost. So I think, Carrie came about at a time where people just probably weren't ready for it. The themes of the show, the staging of the show, and the kind of cultural surroundings of the show all just didn't quite mesh to make it work.
Now that the spring semester is here, I am so excited to let you all know about a publisher, an independent publisher that's celebrating 40 years of great books called Broadview Press. I love Broadview Press. I have so many of their editions of classic literature like Wuthering Heights, which is coming out soon, and it's our book club choice. And they have so many academic books for instructors and for students and the general public. So I've had so many exciting guests on, from guests talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, guests talking about vampire literature, horror literature. I'm looking at you, Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, whose book actually just came out called Horror Theory. Look it up. And I cannot wait because I have two exciting guests coming on soon. And I've recorded their episode, so I know that it's going to be such an interesting conversation. The first is Rachel Tukolsky, who wrote a book called Writing on Fire, a fierce yet friendly guide to writing humanities essays in college. I've used excerpts of it for my Writing 2 course at Montclair. It has gone over so well. I just love what Rachel does. And we get into this in our episode about this metaphor about writing on fire, like how that's a great way to think about free flowing, brainstorming, creative ideas, and getting into that flow state, which, as Rachel explains, happens not just in writing, but in many other avenues. And then the other guest that I have on is David Starkey, who wrote a book called Academic Writing Now, a brief guide for busy students. It is designed to cover the basics of a college writing course in a concise, student-friendly format. Each chapter concentrates on a crucial element of composing an academic essay and is capable of being read in a single sitting, which, for a generation, myself included, I think all of us now, just consumed by digital media or just this attention grabbing technology, reading in a single sitting is definitely a plus. So head to Broadview Press, use the promo code Ivory Tower, and you'll get 20% off every single book in their collection. There's also a really cool digital library collection they have. So if you're a librarian, take a look at that. Message me. If you're a librarian, I'd be happy to show you what that new collection looks like. And I hope you all enjoy your reading.
Particularly as Cats was taking everybody, people forget how massive Cats was. It was taking everybody's ticket money. It was huge. It had, it was sold out for years. Ticket prices were driven so high. It was scalpers were selling tickets for it extortionately high. It was just this huge dominant force on Broadway at the time. So any new show, particularly anything out of the ordinary, was up for a kind of fight when it came to getting audiences.
Well, and when Carrie opens, it's also the same year as Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
And chorus line is still kicking, no pun
Yes.
intended, but which was, I think, really shaped a lot late 70s into early 80s, really revolutionized the behind the scenes type
Yes.
show. When you get
Right.
Dreamgirls, like, so it's very fascinating. Like you said, that's why the cultural history, I'm such a lover of context, like to understand where this fits in. And like I wonder with the cast or and the creative team too, of course. Like how much do they now, because there's been so many years, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about 1988, it leaves Broadway.
Yeah.
Um, that do they think a lot or have opened up a lot to you and Holly about that context? Like, have they seen, oh, this kind of now pieced it together. Like you said, your book is an extreme jigsaw puzzle of not knowing where, but not having the pieces all in front of you. And has the cast recognized, oh, okay, this does make sense though. Like we were part of a moment, like we were part of something really
Yeah.
neat.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of them knew that already. A lot of them said, it felt at the time like it was something very different. And it was the show that actors and dancers and singers wanted to be in. When the auditions were happening, they heard about this show being developed over the last few years, and they were like, we need to be there. We need to be in the show. And all of the best dancers at the time were like, we are going to that audition. We have to be involved in this. And I think since then they have looked back and thought, it was a very different and daring production. I think, a lot of them with hindsight, particularly, when we started doing the podcast, we found that the show, I'm sure you remember, the cast was kind of divided quite uniquely. Half of them were from the US, half of them were from the UK. And it was a really kind of groundbreaking way of casting a show because suddenly you had these two very different cultures thrust together. And we found that a lot of the cast members hadn't really got back together or spoken to each other since that last day of the show because the show closed so quickly. They were kind of sent back to their respective homes very promptly. A lot of them were kind of reuniting, and we kind of had this bizarre, amazing situation where we were kind of reintroducing them to each other, and we were sort of creating. And even beyond our podcast, we heard about they were all getting together on Zoom during the various different lockdowns and stuff, and chatting to each other about it. So I hope that we sort of made them rethink again about their time in the show and kind of think about the good times that they had, some of the bad times they had, but kind of what came out of it in the end. So many of them are still working in theatre. So many of them are sort of adjacent to theatre. There's loads of dance teachers and people who are involved in education and events and things like that. So it really did kind of have a huge impact on a lot of people. And I think what I've sort of learned to respect from doing these projects is, even if something is dismissed as a flop, it still doesn't, hundreds of people put in thousands of hours into making that thing. And people very quickly dismiss things that are seen as a disaster. But for a lot of people, it was their whole life. It was a lot of people's big break. It was a lot of people's first time on Broadway or first time at the RSC, all of these different things for people. And it's something that really affected them and really touched them and was a big part in their lives. So I think, I loved hearing so many individual stories. And we always tried to go beyond the cast as well. We tried to interview people who had been backstage and who had seen the show and had these kind of different links to it to kind of tell a fuller picture, from offstage and on stage and backstage, and kind of get this, as you say, this jigsaw puzzle and put it together. And there will always be pieces of that puzzle missing, because there are, people who are no longer with us, people that we couldn't track down, people who just don't want to talk about the show. It would be amazing to get as many of them as possible into a room, because I think you'd have this ultimate kind of nostalgia party of people remembering things that they probably still haven't quite remembered. But if someone has lots of money and resources, would love to do that. We'd love to come along and be part of it.
Well, I have to say, I think Debbie Allen has been very evasive. Maybe not evasive. I'll say deliberately, which I can understand. I think
Yeah,
she did face a lot of the brunt of criticism,
she did. Yeah,
um, for choreography. While now all of us Carrie fans, and like you said, these were probably the best dancers, one of the best dance shows in terms
yeah,
of choreography and energy and singing at the same time. Like, I don't know again when we're going to see someone like Charlotte Dembois do
yeah.
multiple fouettes as as they're all belting. And um, even with Gene Anthony Ray and the Out for Blood song, which is just an incredible number, you can hear the audience in footage, cheering. Like, even though like they're in on the joke because they started to see, even when they were attending, especially on Broadway, it seems like word had gotten around so much that this is a cult hit. Like, okay,
Yeah,
I remember there's that one audience member who says this is the pig number. And
yeah,
then
yeah.
everyone
People
like
knew. Yeah,
they knew. And but yeah, it just displays like Sally Ann triplets dancing, just
yeah,
these triple threats that I hope one day Debbie Allen, you know, not that she has to open up about it, but I hope she at least sees how many appreciate cur- um her choreography, that it
yeah,
was such a style.
yeah. I think you're right. If you pull all of the different threads of Carrie out, there are so many incredible things about it. It's just when you knit them all together, something doesn't quite work, in the eyes of so many people. And I think, Debbie, yeah, Debbie was one of the people who we couldn't get hold of to speak to, on the podcast or in the book. And I think part of that is because, Debbie Allen, look at her career since then. This was
Mhm.
this was something she did for, a relatively short time 35 years ago, and since then she has gone on to become this megastar, right? She's on, she's directing, she's acting, she's still dancing, she's running huge businesses. She has probably millions of people trying to talk to her about all of the different things she does, and she maybe doesn't want to talk about this project that she did so long ago. But yeah, I think, it's one of those personal decisions, isn't it? I think you kind of, I think you're right. So many people would like to tell her how much they appreciate her work and how much it was part of this amazing show that they love. But yeah, we didn't get the chance to do that, unfortunately. But I hope she maybe she listened to some of the episodes and read the book. Who knows? She might have
Yeah.
copy.
Or right now, we'll shout out Debbie Allen and say how much
Yeah,
we love and appreciate, and I'll
exactly.
clip this out so she can hear it. But yes, Debbie, so many of you love, so many love your choreography, and I know everyone who worked with her, just like Charlotte, Betty Buckley's wind sprint workouts, they
Yeah,
just had such great things to say about. I mean, you can see her energy, her organic nature. Like, that's the thing, is
yeah,
fame
yeah,
too. I think of that number, Hot Lunch Jam, in the movie, especially that
yeah,
one. Like, it's just unfiltered teen angst. Like, and I
yeah,
think that's what is so captured is um the body tells the story in her
yeah.
choreography, or just how she even moves. So,
Yeah, it's hypnotic
yeah.
to watch. And the cast said, she worked them so hard, but she was also this amazing presence in the room, particularly in the tougher times when they knew things were going wrong or they could sense there were problems. Debbie was the one who kind of, brought them together. She was the kind of mother figure almost to so many of them, and looked after them. And they all admired and looked up to her because they'd seen her on TV. You know, she was this, especially the Brits. You know, to have this kind of Hollywood star, this TV star, this movie star come in and work with you so closely was, you know, this huge opportunity. So yeah, they all seem to love working with Debbie.
Yeah, well, and I think we have to mention, or just because I know you've had so many in the Carrie universe in your ears, literally, because you are wearing headphones, that
I keep falling
did
out.
you, well, I think an aspect we don't talk about is the brilliant, well, you do, of course, but I'm speaking for the broad musical theater public here, is the amazing orchestrations. And I'm wondering, did you ever have a chance to talk to, or in your book, for those who I want to purchase your book, do you ever get anyone who is part of the orchestra or like remembers those orchestrations?
So I was able to talk to, in the book, the original orchestrators and the original musical directors of the show, and they gave a bit more insight than we were able to include in the podcast, which was really fascinating. And I don't read music. I don't have a lot of music theory, I suppose, but it's just so interesting to hear people talk about how that process works. And I think learning about that was something that I really loved when we did the podcast. I always assumed that, you know, the composer of a musical does their work, hands over the sheet music, and off you go. But no, it takes these amazing people to kind of bring the music to life for all of the different instruments, for all of the different singers, the singing types. So yeah, to speak to those people was fascinating. We didn't actually get to speak to anyone in the band. I really wish we could have done. Yeah, it was just one of those, you know, there were just quite a lot of them. They were, you know, the musical directors and the orchestrators, I suppose, were used to tell the story of the music. I would have loved to speak to have spoken to Harold Wheeler, who kind of reorchestrated the show when it got to Broadway. I wasn't able to reach him, but he sort of changed the sound of the show. It became a very different sounding show once it got to New York. So to compare the two is really interesting, and you know, people who are very intense fans of the show can listen to those bootlegs and those individual performance recordings and see almost the daily changes in the music and how it was how the sound of the show was changing as time passed. And I think that's such a unique and amazing thing to be able to do with a show from so long ago. You know, usually you get a cast recording of a show, and that's kind of its definitive record. Carrie doesn't have a cast recording, but it does have this kind of archive of different audience recordings, both audio and video recordings from different places. And so to be able to kind of do that analysis and see how the show was changing day to day kind of shows you how slightly chaotic it was, but also how you know, changes were being made daily and how people were having to learn new stuff in the day and perform it that evening. So yeah, a really interesting angle to hear about, I think.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too how in your book you draw so much attention to, like you've brought it up in this discussion, but the US compared to the UK, like that's even in the way the music transfers over to Broadway. Like the what
Yeah,
I would describe is there's a very rock heavy aspect that happens on Broadway, like even in the opening overture, that like it's almost even more brassy. And I wonder again, is that because of the Broadway audience? Is that for an American type sound and then muting it a little for Royal Shakespeare Company? Um,
yeah,
even the
possibly.
cast. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
and the cast had that kind of personality too. I just remember that, like
yeah,
the Brits learned about being more energetic, not energetic, but
yeah.
being like blunt and
Outspoken.
outspoken. And then the Americans learned how to be a little more disciplined.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, there was this, the Brits talk about this kind of friendly tension that developed between the Brits and the Americans when they all got together, because the Americans were so kind of forthright and, you know, they charge to the front of the rehearsal room and do their numbers, whereas the Brits would always kind of hang back a little bit and be a bit judgy. But by the end of the process, they were all kind of so, you know, so close and learned so much from each other, as you say. I think the music point's really interesting. And the reason given by the writers for the change was that, you know, originally they were trying to merge the two worlds of the show into one cohesive sound. Originally, there were two orchestrators, one who kind of tackled the slightly more operatic mother and daughter numbers between Carrie and her mother, the other orchestrator kind of dealt with those pop numbers that were set in the school scenes. I think by the time they got to Broadway, according to the writers, they wanted the sound to be a bit more cohesive and similar across the show. But I think that I'm sure there are kind of other cultural reasons for, you know, what people were used to hearing on Broadway. Wheeler had recently orchestrated Dreamgirls on Broadway, and so he was kind of like, it still is, you know, he still orchestrates shows now, but at the time he was very flavor of the month, I guess that's the phrase he used. He, you know, people loved his work in Dreamgirls, and perhaps they wanted to emulate that success and that sound. So yeah, there are so many different, depends who you ask, you get different answers for different things happening on this show. People remember things so differently sometimes, but yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Well, so what was something, and again, I don't want you to reveal it all because it's in your book, but like what was something that you learned? Because you've been with Carrie the musical so long in just thinking about it, listening, hearing different insights. Is there something that really blew your mind, especially when you were writing your book, like something that came
Yeah.
out because of the writing process that we would be surprised about?
One thing that always, I mean, I've been kind of living in this material for so long that I forget what sort of surprised me the first time round, if that makes sense, because there are so many brilliant individual stories from people. I think there are so many stories that make you just sort of say that can't be true. You know, when you hear about these slightly chaotic rehearsals and performances where things would go wrong, and you know, the whole Barbara Cook story is just this fascinating. The more you delve into it, the more brilliant and hilarious it becomes, because Barbara was playing Carrie's mum here in the UK and basically hated the whole experience. When I was writing the book, I spoke to someone who was a big fan of hers at the time, and he had sent her a letter saying that her performance in Carrie, despite the rest of the show not being to this person's taste, her performance had been great. And Barbara sent this brilliant letter back where she was like, I hate it. There are only 8 days left and then I can get out of this, you know, piece of crap. And, you know, she just these brilliant kind of communications from Barbara, who just sounds like the most hilarious person. One thing that I was really surprised about, the kind of ultimate twist of this story, because you sort of assume that at the end of the tale, everyone goes their separate ways. I found that Terry Hands, the director, later worked on another musical with the producer, Friedrich Kurtz, who had kind of co-funded all of Carrie and taken a lot of the blame. You know, there are all of these stories about him closing the show and sort of trying to cling back as much money as he could, because the show was just sort of hemorrhaging cash by this point because of the poor reviews and everything else that happened. The two of them got together like a few years later in Germany to make another musical, which again, the leading lady ended up leaving. The show closed early. It got terrible reviews. And the whole kind of story on a smaller scale just repeated itself. And I was absolutely kind of blown away by this, because I'd assumed the two of them probably would have just fallen out and never spoken to each other ever again after, you know, the Carrie debacle, I suppose. But to find these records, you know, searching for them, suddenly realizing that they got back together to try again and it still hadn't worked. So that was a really interesting story. But, you know, every cast member, every person we spoke to brought these unique stories to the table. And, you know, it was an interesting study in people's memories as well, because I think this top line version of the Carrie story had kind of cemented itself into the consciousness of so many people. We called it the sort of Wikipedia version of what had happened, because you get these sort of 2 or 3 myths, I suppose, about disasters that had taken place. And even people who were there found themselves repeating these stories until they sort of realized, actually, maybe that's not quite what happened. And you start to kind of chisel away at people's memories, and the stuff that they remember when you do that is really fascinating. So I think it's been a really interesting study in memory and what actually happened, and kind of getting to the bottom of these tall tales has been really fascinating.
Yeah, well, and like I know Eric has his own views on the whole like ancient Greek. Like he's more in,
Yeah,
everyone should listen if they haven't, but he was like we did a whole deep dive of just the source material, the ancient
yeah,
Greek
it's fascinating.
themes. And like he wants to explore the psyche of Terry Hands, like more of the directorial approach. But I think that what's so important you talk about, Chris, is how we create myths or how myths are built and in our own minds and memory. And like the whole, if someone had misheard about make it like Grease the musical or ancient Greece, is that kind of slippage. And again, like a whisper down the lane of,
Yeah, yeah,
the only ones who will really know is Terry Hands, who sadly is no longer here,
mm,
maybe Debbie Allen, because she had been given direction by him.
mm,
And even the creators might not have been in that room when that happened, because, like, as you
yeah,
talk about, the composer and the writer,
yeah,
they're not there in the thick of
yeah.
it in the rehearsal process with Debbie
Yeah.
Allen and Terry Hands.
Yeah, especially on this show, the writers talk quite a lot about feeling excluded from the rehearsal process because they didn't like the work that was unfolding in front of them. It wasn't what they envisioned, and they talk about being essentially cut out of it and not being able to kind of give their notes and not being able to make adjustments. Even when the show had been planned here in the UK, they weren't able to kind of step in and suggest changes, or that's the story according to them. And yeah, so it's a unique show in that it suffered from it became a bit more fractured from what it was originally envisioned to be, I suppose. But yeah, it is an interesting case study in urban legends and myths and what becomes true in people's minds. And I think that's been part of the pleasure of diving into this story, is kind of trying to unpick that truth and find out what really happened. I was amazed to find that someone hadn't already tried to do it. It's such a kind of infamous story that a lot of the tales had just become true. And as you say, we unpick the Greece versus Greece thing in a bit more detail in the book. And yeah, I mean, your episodes with Eric were fascinating, and we've always said that we'd never tried to. We did have a couple of episodes where we described what happened in the show from the perspective of all the people who were watching it and taking part in it. And I do the same in the book across a couple of chapters by piecing together kind of review quotes and quotes from people involved. But it's fascinating to hear someone like Eric, who is a creative person, a director, a writer, rip the show to shreds and kind of try and piece it back together and try and figure out what was happening in the mind of the people who created it. Really interesting. And yeah, I encourage people to watch that if they haven't already, because it's a really deep dive into what Terry Hands may have been thinking. And as you say, I wish we could find out more. I was lucky enough to find some old cassette tapes in a library archive, which with a journalist interviewing Terry Hands and the designer of the show, Ralph Coltay, and the costume designer, Alex Reed. So to hear those voices come to life after having, read so much about them was just fascinating. And there's some great new insight on the approach to the design and the look of the show that I was able to include in the book, thanks to those tapes. So I love that the show is still inspiring people to kind of figure it out and try and work out what was intended to be happening. Yeah, it's fascinating, and as I say, so few shows that close so quickly get that kind of deep analysis, and I think it's brilliant that people are now doing that.
Or that the show, that's something that could be considered a flop, actually gets a revival. Like
Yeah,
that to me is not what makes it not a flop, because um like you said, flops are usually ones we can't recall in memory. And but like, just to, as we're nearing the end, I think we should definitely, if you could touch upon the revival, because like I said, that the Broadway cast was a type of star making. I mean, Betty Buckley was already very well known. I
yeah,
mean, you mentioned Cats. We think of Betty Buckley in
yeah,
memory.
yeah,
But that, Lindsay still performing as the narrator in Joseph
yeah,
now. Charlotte, I saw her in Pippin. She's in Chicago
yeah,
all the time. I mean,
yeah,
Sally Ann Triplett has done so much in the West End.
yeah,
Um, but with the revival, you then have, um, cast members who were in Anastasia. I'm thinking of Christy
yeah.
as Anastasia Altamere. And then I'm trying to remember, how do you pronounce her first name? I'm thinking of
Jenna,
she Jenna, thank you, who
Jenna
played
Dwell, yeah.
Princess Diane.
Yes,
Diana.
yeah. And Derek Klanner, who was also in
Yes.
Anastasia and is, I think, currently in Moulin Rouge on Broadway, yeah, who just came straight out of college to do Carrie. He was young at the
Wow.
time and had sort of interrupted his college career to do it, and now is this huge Broadway star, as so many of them are. And of course, Maren Maisie, who played Margaret White in that revival, who's sadly again is no longer with us, and is just this force of, it's just this extraordinary performer. And we in the podcast we were only able to spend an episode and a bit really on the revival. In the book, I was so happy to be able to talk to some of those people and kind of expand that section and figure out how you take the show, which people have mocked and laughed at for so long, and reinvent it and make it a show that appeals to young performers and young audiences today.
It may be freezing here in the Northeast, but when I received my copy of the Gay and Lesbian Review, it warmed me up instantly. Their new issue is all about kink culture. Let me explain a little. I'm going to read what Jeremy C. Fox, the managing editor, has to say about this issue. He says this issue marks a bit of a departure for the Gay and Lesbian Review as we crack open the bedroom door to explore the practices and paraphilias that interest or obsess some LGBT people and the roots of their appeal. Several future articles delve deeply into why certain kinks turn some of us on, and whether we can discern historical and aesthetic rationales behind these fixations. This magazine features articles such as The Power of the Foot. Oh, yeah, they're going there with foot kinks. Maplethorpe's Gift to America, Reclaiming the Sacred Dungeon. Tumblr was a gateway to kink, and Cruising with Boyd McDonnell. You definitely want to get your hands on the kink issue here. I have an exclusive promo code that those at the Gay and Lesbian Review have granted to you all. It is ITBR Choice. Enter it when you check out on the glreview.org, and you will get a free issue of the magazine. I hope you all enjoy your reading, and it'll definitely keep you nice and cozy.
And some people loved that revival, some people hated that revival, but it kind of gave Carrie a new life. And now when people are doing that show, they don't think of it as a flop. When people are performing that show in community theatre groups or in colleges, they're really excited to be part of it. It's a really unique, challenging show for people to be part of. It makes you really think about how to do, the staging, how to, the music is challenging. It's a really fun, modern, unusual show to do. And I think, the fact that a whole new generation of people are discovering this story that King created all of those years ago in a different form again is really amazing. And, there's a brilliant sort of story behind that revival of the demand from fans to see the show reinvented through the 90s, when so many people heard about this show for the first time but weren't able to experience it. It was always kind of just out of their reach. They were able to watch crackly old videos of it and listen to cassette tapes of it, but they weren't ever able to see it. They could just hear about it, and it was this sort of tale passed down. So to kind of to have that force of fandom behind it to eventually lead to a reinvention of the story, I think is a really amazing end to the tale of Carrie the musical.
Yeah, well, I was actually there in Greenwich Village in the revival. I saw it.
Yeah.
And it is just fascinating to think of, you know, that there was an Anastasia, Princess Diana, Derek in Moulin Rouge. Again, I think Maren Maisie I had also seen in Next to Normal. She was incredible.
Yes,
Such a beautiful, empowering presence,
yeah,
performer, powerhouse. And again, I think it's the material, like why there's been so many movie adaptations of Carrie, and I think we'll continue to see
yeah,
iterations. Um, I mean, I always describe the original musical. I mean, I prefer my preference is for the original because I'm a huge fan of the choreography. Um, but I also think both have different lanes. Like for me,
yeah.
the revival, like you said, it can go on in colleges and community theaters because of resonating with mental health. Bullying is more explicit
Yeah.
in this version, where I think the original, to me, it has more of a psychoanalytic libidinal desire. Like sex, to me, sex and like death are really in the original. Like there's
Yes.
something
Yeah. Yeah.
so erotic in the original with the high schoolers that comes through the movement of their bodies. But again,
Yeah.
I don't think the original would have been performed by colleges as
No,
like
that's true.
it's
That's
very
true.
hard to put on colleges.
Yeah, but this new version is very adaptable. It's been, as we talk about in the book a bit, it's been done in huge theaters and tiny intimate theaters. It's been done in
Hmm.
immersive settings. Directors can really put their own stamp on it and pull it to pieces and throw it back together again. And I think that's brilliant. I think the original production, as you say, was its own special creation. It's very rigid, and I can't imagine how anyone would have taken it and done it in a different way. Maybe it's possible. Lots of people certainly wanted to do that through the 90s. Drag queens and other people. So many different people were desperate to get their hands on this, and they weren't allowed to do anything with it. But now you can kind of take it and make it your own, which is really interesting. And it is a story that you can genuinely do in lots of different ways. And it was great to hear from directors who had loved the original, but now we're able to take the story and kind of stage it in different ways and introduce new people to it.
Hmm. But I will say to Dean Pitchford, Larry Cohen, um, and why am I forgetting?
Michael Gore.
Michael Gore, thank you. That there is a thirst for the original to like be done as a concert version, with its
Yeah.
choreography intact. But again, we could all,
Yeah.
thankfully, we have footage. Um,
Yes.
but for my final question, Chris, this has just been so wonderful. I'm just curious, is there any other musical? Again, I don't think anything can compare to what we've talked about, what you've put together of this rich cultural history. But do you think that there's, excluding Rocky Horror Picture Show, because I know that that would be a popular one, but do you think there's another musical that does have like a cult fan base, something that's like now emerging? Like maybe people are starting to think about it and it's been forgotten in
Mm.
history, but has always maybe had a small subset of a fan base.
Yeah, Holly and I have spoken for hours and hours about this and tried to figure out how we do a kind of Out for Blood 2 where we find another musical and do the same treatment. And we've really struggled to find anything that has the same kind of status as Carrie. The closest big musical flop, I think, is the Spider-Man musical Turn Off the Dark, which is mired in lawsuits and all sorts of stuff. And there is a brilliant book about it by someone involved in the show, which kind of does the job, right? I don't think you can really improve on the book that exists about the Spider-Man, the chaotic story of the Spider-Man musical. And so we sort of started to think, maybe there's a version where we talk about musicals that weren't flops, but have interesting creation stories. And one story I love is Little Shop of Horrors, which is, a sort of cult musical, which certainly can't be described as a flop, but has a similar kind of interesting, twisty backstory of different versions. It started as a B movie and had very small fringe productions, big Broadway productions, and now continues to be performed in different ways. So I think that's a really interesting one. But there are some flops, which kind of closed very quickly and are now being reassessed in similar ways to the way Carrie has been. Merrily We Roll Along is one which closed very quickly in its original incarnation, and now has been revived successfully. There's a movie being made over like a period of 30 years or something. Stuff like stories like that which were dismissed very quickly but have come back. Parade is a really interesting one. Parade is a brilliant musical, but didn't last very long in its original Broadway show, and is now back, and new people are discovering it and kind of being introduced to it for the first time. So I don't think there's ever, as the poster said, there's never been a musical like her when it came to Carrie. And I think there isn't ever going to be quite the same twisty-turny, chaotic story of a musical. The book that came out very quickly after Carrie closed was called Not Since Carrie, and that the premise of that book was that there would never be a flop quite as disastrous as Carrie was. And I'm not quite sure if there ever will be a story quite like this one. Maybe there will be one day, but I'd love to, if anyone has any suggestions for what we could talk about in quite as much detail, I'd love to hear them. But
Yeah.
I think that, this story is so unique and has so many different threads to it that it would be hard to find something to talk about in quite as much depth.
Yeah. I was gonna say there's definitely though a lot of musicals um gone in the middle of the night with marquees disappearing. Like, I mean, I know you had an episode about Rebecca, but I remember seeing that
Rebecca, yeah,
marquee. That was a great episode you had. But even Tuck Everlasting, I know it
yeah,
did show, but then I think it like quickly closed.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I'm even thinking I love that whole Little Shop of Horrors. Again, it's not like you don't have to talk about the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but right, that's not a flop.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I think that there's something about the Gothic musical which just
yeah,
makes for really tricky, uh, a labyrinthian type excursion. Like Lestat, I'm thinking of,
yeah, yeah.
had that type of origin. It was just so many
Haunted.
Dance with the Vampires, I think, was
Yeah,
another.
yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of potential, I think, for your part two with Holly. Um,
Yeah. Plus, we wouldn't have to change our name with those shows, right? We need something that's a bit dark and bloody to make the name make sense. So, yeah, yeah. Any
yeah.
ideas? Send them over.
Only bloody musicals. Sweeney
Yeah,
Todd's on
exactly.
Broadway
Sweeney
now. That
Todd's, we
one
could do that.
be good.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Maybe,
thank
yeah,
you.
we we might need to do a mega mix of like bloody, deathly musicals.
Yeah, but if I guess if we think about it, Sweeney Todd is one of the most highly successful gory
Yeah,
musicals.
yeah, yeah,
But gore is
definitely.
tough to do on stage.
It is.
Um,
It is.
so as we know from Carrie and the Blood
Yes,
scene,
exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. Don't
well,
ask anyone to do blood on stage. It always
no,
ends
do not.
messily.
We can do water on stage, but when it comes to blood, I think they
Yeah,
haven't figured out that technical aspect yet. But Chris, this has just been so wonderful. I would love
it
if you could
has.
just, share out how everyone out here can follow you, your podcast, get your hands on your book. Yeah, mention it all.
Yeah, I mean, now is the time. If you want to go back, you can listen to the whole series of Out for Blood. It's on the Broadway Podcast Network, but you can download it on, Apple and Spotify and all the usual places. And the book is out now. It came out this week. I'm going to hold the copy up in a kind of like advertising way, and you can order it from, your favorite bookstores or direct from the publisher Bloomsbury. Yeah, I hope people enjoy it. I hope it introduces people to this story. Either via the podcast or the book. It's been a real pleasure to tell the tale of Carrie.
Yeah, well, it was wonderful having you here. I
Thank you.
can't
It's
wait for
great to
your
speak to
next.
you.
Thank you. I can't wait for your next iteration. Let's see what happens. I'm sure you and
Yeah,
Holly, you have magic plans and up
there'll
your
be something.
sleeves.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. There's always something to talk about in the world of Carrie, so we'll probably keep coming back.
Oh, there is, I'm sure. You could even like start to deep dive the origin of the movies. So
Yeah, maybe. Don't
let's
give us
let's see.
ideas.
Yeah, well, and Stephen King is out there. Maybe
That's
eventually.
true. That's true. Give us a call, Stephen.
Yeah, Stephen. We need your
Need you.
I know he loved the musical, so we need your
Yeah.
reflection right now.
Yes, that would be
Okay.
amazing.
Thank you so much, Chris, and this has just been so
Thank you.
wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk.
Yep, and thanks to all out there and definitely get your hands on Chris's book and all things Carrie. Okay. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye.